Miss Nobody from Nowhere by Elizabeth Ashton. Chapter 8. It was quite by chance that Angela noticed the advertisement. She was idly scanning the columns of a newspaper while she waited for Ralph to go riding when her father's name caught her eye. It was one of those notices put out by solicitors appealing for next of kin who upon application would learn something to their advantage. Several times it had crossed her mind that Edmund Sullivan must have left something that should be of right be hers, and she had intended to make inquiries when a suitable opportunity presented itself. She made a note of the solicitor's address. The name was not unfamiliar to her. Selwyn and Hampson had managed her father's affairs, and Mr. Hampson was known to her. She would go and see him at once, for by good luck Ralph had asked her to go to London with him at the end of the week. He was being interviewed for a job and had declared it would be an excuse for a binge. Clive had raised no objection, merely remarking that he was sorry he was too busy to accompany them, and Angela was looking forward to the excursion. While Ralph kept his appointment, she could call upon the solicitors. She had been hoping that she might find she had something of her own, however small, for it still irked her pride to be utterly dependent upon Clive for every penny, especially as all was not well between them. Mrs. Stratton remained firmly enthroned as mistress of the house, and Angela continued to feel like a guest, and one who could set no limit to her visit. Clive had said he was looking for another property, but seemed half-hearted in his efforts to find one. She suspected he was secretly loath to leave Abbotswood, in spite of its memories, or could it be because of them? Once, when Mrs. Stratton had gone into Sherborne and the men were out on the farm, Angela had crept into Celia's room for another look at Jasmine's portrait. To her excited fancy, the jewel-hard eyes under their heavy lids had seemed to her to stare at her with insolent triumph. Her predecessor knew her influence could never be exercised, as she reached out from beyond the grave to clutch at the man she had wronged, but would never relinquish. Jasmine had been the type of woman who, having once annexed a member of the opposite sex, would expect to hold him in thrall forever. Deprived of the one she wanted, she refused to loose her tentacles from the one who had wanted her. Was the accident really suicide, or was that the measure of Clive's self-reproach because he had hesitated to forgive her desertion? Her self-love must have been deeply wounded by his hesitation, and the chagrin caused by the imperviousness of the one man she had found was indispensable. Clive's attitude towards that unknown man, Angela thought, was unfair. It was to his credit that he had chosen to respect his marriage vows, and Jasmine had known he was not free in the risk which she was taking. She too had made vows which she had promptly broken, so she was every bit as reprehensible as her lover. But Clive had been in love with Jasmine, and her tragic end had given him a profound shock, so that, however badly she had behaved, he naturally put all the blame upon her traducer, and his name had become anathema in the Stratton household. Angela shivered as she looked up at the glowing beauty that had wrought such a coil, and pitied her rival. Lovely, passionate and undisciplined, she had brought happiness to no one, least of all to herself. The sapphire eyes seemed to mock her compassion. "Pity me, do you, nitwit?" she seemed to say. "What do you know of the wild ecstasies I enjoyed? Wouldn't you give your right arm to be able to kindle in Clive the passion I did, and leave him eating his heart out for you, as he still is, even after 9 long years? Even after 9 long years, Angela went out, even after 9 long years. Angela went out of the room, softly closing the door behind her. Clive's feeling for her had died in less than a week. It could not survive the poignancy of his memories. She fancied she could hear derisive laughter coming from behind the shut door. Truly, Jasmine haunted Abbotswood. Angela felt a lift of spirits on the Friday morning, upon which she left for London with Ralph. They made an early start, for they were going by road, and Ralph was in a lively mood. "It's a long way. Perhaps we shan't get back tonight, in which case your reputation may be endangered, Mrs. Stratton," he said gaily. "Do you think if that happens Clive will shoot me?" Angela shuddered. Celia had wanted Clive to shoot another man, the one who had stolen Jasmine from him, which gave a sinister overtone to Ralph's light-hearted question, but she managed to return brightly. "I'm sure he wouldn't want to waste his ammunition," and added a little bitterly, "He wouldn't care." "Oh, he would, but I'm sure he trusts you. You're not like Jassy. She was a bitch." Why did he have to mention Jasmine on this perfect morning? For it was a lovely day, when she had for once escaped the brooding presence in the old house. Perhaps he had telepathically caught her own thought. She told him that Clive had given her all the details of that sad story. "You think she drowned herself on purpose?" she concluded. "Stuff! Jazz loved life too well to do that. Of course it was an accident," Ralph said reassuringly. "She could always get herself another man if Clive wouldn't forgive her. She wasn't fussy." But she must have really loved the one she ran away with, to ditch Clive on his wedding night. Sheer perversity, if you ask me. Jas liked to be dramatic. You see, she wasn't all that gone on Clive. She knew him too well, and they say familiarity breeds contempt. Ma made a big mistake by persuading her into it, and it would please her twisted sense of humour to think of Clive defrauded at the last moment. It was a cruel thing to do, Angela said heatedly. Jas was cruel. Oh, well, you knew her well. Oh, well, you knew her, but can't we talk about something else? Good idea. Don't know why I brought her up. She's best forgotten. Angela heartily agreed, but it seemed impossible to consign Jasmine to oblivion. Ralph left her in the city, and she wended her way through the busy streets to the solicitor's offices. She had met Mr. Hampson socially, but she had never attended his place of business before. It was up a dark, narrow alleyway, and the interior seemed dingy and dim after the brightness outside. She was asked to wait in a stuffy little anteroom while a clerk reported her name and business. She thought he looked at her a little oddly, and she wondered if there had been other claimants to her father's estate. Her mother's relations, she supposed, would be next in line, and they would forget that they had not liked her father if there were any money to be gained. Mr. Hampson will see you now, Mrs. Stratton. Angela got up and followed the clerk down a narrow passageway. He opened a door at the end of it almost reverently and announced her name. The silver-haired man behind the desk stood up. Good morning, Mrs. Stratton. Will you take a seat? He indicated the chair in front of his desk, then reseating himself, looked at a note on his pad. You've come about the late Mr. Sullivan's estate. He paused, stared at her, took off his glasses, rubbed them, and stared at her again as he put them on. Good Lord, you can't be Anne Sullivan. I was, she corrected him. Then it struck her that he must believe she had been killed in the air crash. I survived. Briefly, she told him her story, while he gaped at her. A truly wonderful escape, he commented when she had finished, and almost incredible. My dear young lady, I'm delighted that you survived. Of course, I recognized you. I saw you at your mother's funeral and upon other occasions. You know I was a friend of your father's as well as his man of affairs. Why didn't you contact me before? Angela explained that she had intended to do so eventually, but had so much else upon her mind. Getting married, here she blushed charmingly, and settled in her new home, which was some distance from London. Of course, the kindly brown eyes twinkled. Learning to be a new wife. He referred to a file on his desk. Did you know that your father left a quite considerable sum of money? You surprise me. We never seemed to be well off. She remembered Clive's indictment that archaeologists sold treasures on the side, but her father would never do that, however hard-pressed he was. Edmund was always a careful man, Mr. Hampson explained. He needed to save to finance his expeditions, but he invested well and wisely. He mentioned a fairly large sum. There will be estate duty, of course, and as a matter of formality you'll have to provide your identity. You have a birth certificate, passport, marriage certificate, perhaps? My husband has my papers, but not a birth certificate. I can get a copy of that, I suppose. Of course. It was a very sad business about your father. The world has been deprived of a very eminent man. My sympathy, Anne. Thank you. It was a great blow. But the knowledge had come to her so gradually that it could hardly be described as a blow, though only now did she realise how completely alone in the world she was, except for the Strattons, who did not want her. Unaware of the true circumstances, Mr. Hampson said genially, At least you've got a husband to console you. Is he with you? I should like to meet him. Angela told him Clive had been unable to get away and her brother-in-law had brought her up to London. Consolation from Clive in that direction had never been forthcoming. It was when she had discovered her loss that he had become remote. Mr. Hampson required her to sign certain documents here and then, including a letter of application for her birth certificate, which he said he would obtain for her. You're not much like your father, he observed with the candour of an old family friend. The Sullivans were fair. You take more after your mother, perhaps. I don't think I'm much like either of them, she told him, and remembered Clive had asked her if there was a likeness. It flashed into her mind with a spurt of anger that he must have been wondering if anyone would recognise her as her father's daughter, and merely because his stepmother had an absurd prejudice against her surname. She took her leave of the old man who had come from behind his professional facade to condole with her. He said he would be communicating with her and would be glad to help her in any way he could. She had arranged to meet Ralph for lunch and found the place he had mentioned without difficulty, for London was familiar to her. She wondered how she could counter his questions regarding her morning's activities, but he did not ask any, being too full of his own affairs to notice her abstraction. His interview had gone well, and he was confident that he had landed the job. This, he declared, was his big break, the opportunity for which he had been waiting for so long, while Clive's absences tied him to Sherborne. Thank heaven he's got himself wed, he ejaculated jubilantly. He ejaculated jubilantly. He won't want to be going off now he's got you around. Angela wished she was sure of that. They went to a matinee of a popular musical and drove home after the rush hour through the gloaming. Even Ralph's exuberance was a little wilted by fatigue, and he relapsed into silence. As the miles flew by, Angela came to a decision. Whatever maggot had been in Clive's brain when he asked her not to disclose her maiden name, she would no longer obey his wishes. Mrs. Stratton could get over her absurd prejudice against her nomenclature, for she would no longer deny her father. Besides, there would be much correspondence coming to her while the estate was being wound up, and it would be a little deceitful to endeavour to conceal what was going on. And why should she? It was time she asserted herself. Submissiveness had got her nowhere with Clive, and had given his stepmother the idea that she was a non-entity. The discovery that she had means of her own had given her new confidence, and she determined that she would recognise her life on a more satisfactory basis and have a showdown with Clive. If he wished to be rid of her, she would go, but she would not stand for any more blather about Jasmine. It was late when they reached Abbotswood, and Angela left the field to Ralph, for it was his day and her own concerns could wait. Celia was not very enthusiastic about his job. Her possessive nature shrank from releasing her chick from her maternal apron strings, but Clive congratulated him heartily. So I'll only have you left, Celia said to Clive. Don't overlook Angela, and no doubt an increasing brood of grandchildren. Oh, don't overlook Angela, and no doubt an increasing brood of grandchildren, Ralph told her lightly. Mrs. Stratton's face darkened. Only courtesy grandchildren, she pointed out acidly. Clive isn't really my son. It would have been so different if... She sighed pathetically. If they were Jasmine's, Angela mentally finished the sentence and caught a sombre look on her husband's face. Had he had the same thought? There would not be any children if he did not change his attitude towards her, but perhaps he did not want them from her. The thought was painful, for Angela would dearly like to have a family. She had no opportunity to speak to Clive next day, for he left early to go to a stock sale in Devonshire, and did not return until very late. She could have gone to him after they retired, but she shrank from doing that, afraid he might think she intended to make another advance, and her pride would not allow her to so cheapen herself. On the following morning she received a bulky envelope from Selwyn and Hampson, containing, among other documents, a copy of her father's will. They were all seated at the breakfast table, for Mrs. Stratton had ceased to take hers upstairs, and since Angela rarely had any mail, they were eyeing the typewritten pages curiously. Ralph said, "My lord, that all looks very official. Come into a fortune, Angela." "Sort of," she returned brightly. "This is a copy of the last will and testament of my dear father, Edmund Sullivan." Dead silence followed her pronouncement. Looking round a little nervously, Angela saw Clive's gaze was fixed apprehensively upon his stepmother. Ralph looked incredulous, while as for Mrs. Stratton... Celia's face had gone perfectly white, and her eyes were glittering, while her hands were tearing savagely at her table napkin. The only sound that filled the quiet room was the noise of rending linen. When at length she spoke, her voice was hoarse. "Did you say Edmund Sullivan?" "Yes," Angela met her glaring eyes bravely. "He was an archaeologist, you know, and quite famous in his field. I'd been with him on a dig in Persia before he was killed in an air crash." She got no further. Celia had risen from her seat and turned her baleful gaze upon Clive. "How could you do this to me?" "Mother, he began to expostulate. "Never call me that again!" Her voice rose shrilly. You married a girl whose father ruined my daughter? A thief? A seducer?" White-hot fury welled up in Angela at this libel. "How dare you slander my father?" she blazed. "He was as fine and honourable a man who ever walked." And then the hideous truth struck her. "No," she gasped. "It wasn't Daddy. It couldn't have been Daddy." Celia stared at Angela with intense animosity. "Fine and honourable indeed! Who are you trying to kid? Wasn't he in Greece in—" She mentioned a date. Can you deny that? Oh, I always felt there was something wrong about it, you under your meek ways, worming yourself in here. But how Clive could... She choked. He didn't know, Angela whispered. I'd lost my memory. So this was the reason why Clive had turned from her when he had learned who she was, but his aversion was quite unjustifiable. Her mind went back to that year in Greece, when Edmund had been away a long time. She had missed him badly, for her mother had been more than usually ailing and peevish, and she had been only a schoolgirl. Her mother's continual whine, he's having a whale of a time, you bet, with all those youngsters on the site, with never a thought for us. Shouldn't be surprised if he never came back at all. But Edmund had come back, returning swiftly when he was summoned, for Angela had been very ill, neglected bronchitis turning to pneumonia, and calling weakly for her father. Whatever he felt about his wife, he had loved his child. The moment's doubt passed like a cold douche as Angela's love and loyalty rose up in revolt against it. The evidence was only circumstantial, and her father, could not possibly have stooped to be Jasmine's lover. She became aware that Clive was making belated explanations to his stepmother, and recalled that neither Celia nor Ralph had heard the facts of their meeting before. Briefly, he related how Angela had been found and how he had cared for her, not knowing who she was. Ralph was looking a little stunned, but Celia broke out again into violent vituperation. Never heard such a tale! Lost her memory indeed! If she had it, it was a pretence. She knew very well that if you'd known her identity, you'd have pushed her back into that ravine along with that brute of a father. Her voice changed to a passionate appeal. Wouldn't you, Clive? There was almost supplication in her eyes. No, Clive returned. She was injured and needed help. Were she 50 times Sullivan's daughter, I'd have tended her. You soft fool, Celia hissed. She turned her venomous gaze back to Angela. To bring you here, to put you in my darling's place, it's enough to bring her out of her grave. Well, you've never let her lie, Ralph interposed. Look, Mother, all this happened a decade ago, and even if Edmund Sullivan did have an affair with Jas, which is by no means proved, Angela threw him a grateful glance, and she's a sweetie, nice girl, and Clive's darned lucky to get her. So suppose we all forget about what's past and should have been buried long ago. Celia looked at her son as if she had never seen him before. You too, Ralph, she said. Froth appeared on her lips, and she fell back into her chair, her head on the table. Jasmine, she whispered, and became still. There was a moment of stunned silence, punctuated by Celia's stertorous breathing. Clive threw one reproachful glance at Angela, then bent over his stepmother. Ring Dr. Murray, Ralph, he bade his brother. She's had a stroke. Ralph ran to the telephone while Clive lifted Mrs. Stratton into his arms, preparatory to carrying her upstairs, and Angela faltered inadequately. I'm sorry, Clive. Ignoring her apology, he told her curtly to follow him upstairs. Obediently, she crept up the staircase after him and into Celia's room. There, under his instructions, she stripped the bed of its counterpane and pillows so that he could lay his burden down flat. He loosened Celia's clothing and felt for her pulse. His face creased with anxiety. Through the open door to the adjoining dressing room, Jasmine gazed down at them in all her luscious beauty. As if suddenly aware of her, Clive jerked up his head and glanced distastefully towards the portrait. Please shut that door, he commanded. Angela recollected that he disliked that picture of Jasmine, considering it did not do her justice. Noiselessly, she slipped across the room and reached for the door handle. The door opened inwards, and involuntarily her eyes turned toward the picture. Jasmine's eyes seemed alive with triumph, for had she not shattered Angela's tranquillity for all time, destroying her cherished image of her father and causing an unbridgeable gulf to open between her and her husband? Angela pulled the door shut and felt a momentary relief when the scornful face was hidden behind it, but the damage was done. Clive would never forgive her for blurting out her identity. But how could she have anticipated the devastating effect of her disclosure? For he had given her no hint of what to expect. Naturally, she had never connected her father with Jasmine. The very idea was completely incongruous, and if Clive had ever met Edmund Sullivan, he would know that. She leaned against the closed door, watching him with yearning in her eyes. Surely it would have been better if he had told her, when she had remembered her name, what he believed about her father, instead of resorting to the feeble subterfuge of asking her to conceal her surname. That he did believe the slander, and had turned from her as a result, was only too painfully obvious. It explained everything that had puzzled her about his behaviour. His withdrawal since that night at Bamiyan. Only a very genuine feeling for her, in short, love, could overcome his revulsion, and that he had never felt towards her. How bitterly he must regret his refusal to accept her suggestion, and wish that he had refrained from making their marriage a reality. Those few nights together had crowned her womanhood, and were her most treasured memory, but they had forged a bond between them which now he would be seeking means to break. Ralph scratched on the outer door and slipped inside. He had caught Dr. Murray before he had set out on his rounds, and he would be with him in a few moments. He looked fearfully at his mother's recumbent form. "Is there anything I can do?" Clive shook his head. "It will be hospital for her, if—" He broke off. Every moment that passed was touch and go with Celia. "You can take Angela downstairs," he went on. "Better give her a drink." I'd rather stay here," Angela whispered. She wanted to share Clive's vigil, but his eyes were steel as he told her, "There's nothing you can do here. Go along with Ralph." Repulsed, for it was his sake that she had wanted to stay, she had allowed Ralph to lead her out of the room and downstairs. But not into the dining room, from whence the maid had not yet cleared the debris of breakfast, but into the sitting room. He seemed to bear no rancour for her part in the morning's debacle. He settled her into an armchair with a cushion behind her back with solicitude, as if she were an invalid. "A drop of brandy?" he inquired. "It'll help you to pull yourself together." She refused. She did not need anything, she told him. "You ought to be hating me," she said sadly. "Rubbish," he said briskly. "You haven't done anything. Ma's cult of jazz has become a sort of mania with her, and anything can bring on a stroke with people of her age." He looked at Angela curiously. "It's life's supreme irony that you and Clive should have been thrown together." "Kismet," she said, and sighed. "It's the sort of fate that pursues the characters in a Greek drama. In some ways it's quite appropriate," she laughed drearily. "There's always been something classical about Clive and his admiration for Greek culture." She winced at the memories her words recoiled, Clive showing her the Macedonian coin in faraway Nuristan, his interest in the people's supposed Greek origin, and wished she were still the nameless waif of those carefree days, and remembered Clive had wished it also. The arrival of Dr. Murray cut short further conversation. Ralph took him upstairs, and Angela sat on, feeling excluded. Hearing footsteps going upstairs, the telephone being used, and footsteps reascending. Finally, Ralph reappeared. "An ambulance is coming for her," he announced. "Would you go and pack a case for her? Nightwear and so forth. Clive says you'll know better than we should what she'll need." Angela went back upstairs, thankful to be able to perform some small service. Mrs. Stratton's condition was unchanged, and Clive sat beside her, holding her hand, as if he had hoped by that contact to retain her in life. "Excuse me." Ralph brought in a small case, and Angela, as quietly as possible, opened drawers and cupboards, extracting nightgowns, slippers, dressing gown, and such oddments that she thought the patient might require. She had just finished when the ambulance drew up outside, and throughout her task, Clive had never once looked at her. It struck her as a little strange that he who was not her son was showing much greater concern for Celia than Ralph was. That was explained to her later. Celia was taken away, Clive going with her. Ralph was to go to the hospital in the afternoon. Angela went to consult Celia's trainee about food, for even if the heavens were about to fall, men must still eat. She helped the girl, whose name was Maureen, prepared a menu for both lunch and dinner, for she concluded that they would all be present for the latter meal. She was glad to have some occupation, and a curious numbness lay over her heart. Over lunch, Ralph told her, "Poor old Clive seems to be taking it hard. Ma's always been devoted to him, though she isn't his mother. She absorbed herself in him and Jasmine. Me she hadn't a lot of time for. I was so much younger than they were, and of course," he grinned wryly, "I wasn't the heir to Abbotswood. I was sent to boarding school when I was quite small to get me out of the way, and then to college. My old man was all right, but he was getting on, and he hadn't a lot to say to a young lad. And he thought a lot more of Clive. It was Clive's mother who was the love of his life, so it's only natural he clung to him. I don't think he'd had a lot of time for Jasmine. Neither had I. Of course, he died before the wedding." "Did you go to it?" Angela inquired. "No, I had measles and was in the school sanatorium, so I missed all the fun," he told her regretfully. "Of course, I was given a very expurgated account of what happened, but personally I think Clive was well rid of Jasmine." "He still grieves for her," Angela said pensively. "What, after all this while?" Ralph looked astonished. "Don't you kid yourself, Angel. He's had a whale of a time on those safaris of his. I'm only surprised—" He stopped and looked embarrassed. That he gave up his freedom to marry me, Angela finished for him. But I told him he mustn't feel tired if he wanted to go off again. Ralph looked at her oddly. What did he say to that? He took me at my word. He was half inclined to join a German expedition to Bolivia until duty brought him home. Ralph laughed wholeheartedly. I'm not surprised. If my bride on my honeymoon told me she didn't mind if I went to Timbuktu, I couldn't get away fast enough. Not very flattering, were you, Angel? This was such a new point of view that Angela could only stare at him blankly. But surely Clive couldn't have imagined that I didn't want him, she gasped. I was being self-sacrificing, or so I thought. Let's hope he appreciated your nobility. Angela sighed. It doesn't matter whether he did or he didn't now. He'll never forgive me for causing Mrs. Stratton to have a stroke, nor for being who I am. Now don't you go getting morbid, Ralph chided her. Anything might have caused Ma's stroke. She had a high blood pressure. As for being who you aren't responsible for your pa's sins. No, and I'm perfectly certain he was not responsible for your sister's tragedy. Don't see that it matters much either way. They're both dead. It matters to me. I want to clear his name, Angela cried vehemently. Except for that one moment of doubt when she had recalled her father's lengthy absence in Greece, she had become more and more convinced that Edmund Sullivan could not have had an intimate connection with Jasmine Stratton. From what she knew of his character and integrity, the supposition was simply ludicrous, and it was mere coincidence that his expedition had been in Greece at the same time as she was, an unlucky coincidence since it had caused their names to be linked. Ralph shrugged his shoulders indifferently. Best let sleeping dogs lie, he advised her. You'll only stir up a lot of mud. I intend to vindicate him, she said stubbornly, though whether by doing so she could change Clive's attitude towards herself she dared hardly hope. It seemed he had gone too far away from her to be recalled, but she could not allow the slur to continue to sully her father's memory. My sweet child, Ralph began, your loyalty does you credit. She looked up quickly, dark eyes alert under delicate black brows. Clive had used those very words. He had also said he did not wish to destroy her illusions. That was why he had not told her upon the night when he had related Jasmine's story that he believed her father was the man involved. Her resolution strengthened, for it was Clive, not herself, who was deluded. But, Ralph went on, sometimes it's best not to know the truth. Not in this case, Angela returned firmly. I shan't rest until I've discovered it. Ralph said he must go to the hospital after lunch, for though he had ascertained over the phone that there was no change, he felt guilty about not sharing Clive's vigil. She might regain consciousness and ask for us, he said jauntily, but Angela was not deceived. He feared that if he were absent too long she might die while he was not there. She hoped fervently that Mrs. Stratton would recover, though her vindictiveness had destroyed the sympathy she would otherwise have felt for her. Left to herself, she made phone calls upon her own behalf, for a plan was beginning to evolve, the execution of which depended upon Celia's survival. Clive had been short-sighted, she thought. He should have told her the truth, for he must have known that there was a risk that she might inadvertently betray her identity. Unfortunately, she had done it deliberately, being quite unaware of the sinister significance of her disclosure. She had hoped desperately that Clive would realize that she had not known what she was doing. He had always treated her with kindness and consideration, but recalling his cold condemnatory eyes when he had last looked at her, she feared that she had trespassed beyond all hope of reconciliation. Where Jasmine and Jasmine's kin were concerned, he had neither understanding nor mercy. She had nothing to do but wait for the two men to return, as presumably they would for dinner. It was one of those occasionally lovely days in May, which give a foretaste of the summer to come, but she could not appreciate it. Rain would have been more in keeping with her mood, and the sunshine seemed to mock her. She dreaded the inevitable encounter with Clive, and the cruel things he might say to her, which would hurt her all the more because she so desperately wanted to be able to comfort him.